He had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, and in all that time he had become a familiar figure to almost everyone around. The streets were quiet, lined with neat little houses, trimmed lawns, and the occasional dog barking in the distance. It was a peaceful place, the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other while taking out the trash, where neighbors borrowed sugar and returned it with a smile, and where life moved slowly, without too many surprises. That was at least how life used to be for him. He was 72 now, a man whose body carried the marks of hard work and years of service, but whose mind remained sharp and alert. There was a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't need to shout to be noticed. People respected him, not just because he was a veteran, but because he had earned it through decades of honesty, kindness, and unwavering courage. He had served his country in ways most people could only imagine, and those experiences had shaped him into someone who could remain calm when others panicked. Someone who understood the importance of rules, but also the importance of questioning authority when it overstepped its bounds. Every morning, he followed the same routine. He would wake up before the sun rose, make a simple breakfast, and sit by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Birds would flit from tree to tree, the mail carrier would make his rounds, and occasionally the sound of children laughing would drift through the air. It was ordinary, yet comforting, and it reminded him why he had chosen this small town over bigger, more chaotic cities. Here he could live quietly, without unnecessary drama, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. But even in the calmest neighborhoods, trouble could arrive unexpectedly. In recent months, there had been subtle changes in how the Homeowners Association operated. The HOA had always been strict, enforcing rules about lawn heights, mailbox styles, and the color of shutters. But lately, some of the members seemed to think they could take that power a step further. Notices were sent over trivial matters, letters arrived questioning things that no one had ever cared about before, and whispers spread about enforcing community standards more aggressively. At first he ignored it. He had seen organizations like this before, groups that wanted control more than fairness. He knew that as long as he stayed calm and followed basic rules, there was little they could do. One afternoon, as he trimmed a small bush in front of his house, he noticed a car slowly driving past. It wasn't unusual. Neighbors came and went all the time, but something about the way it lingered made him raise an eyebrow. The windows were tinted, and there were two men inside watching his house with more than casual interest. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Probably just passing through, he muttered to himself, but the sense of being observed stuck. Over the next few days, small signs appeared that something had changed. Letters were left in his mailbox that seemed official, with official-looking stamps and seals. They warned him about violations he hadn't committed, about fines he hadn't agreed to, and about meetings he didn't want to attend. He read each one carefully, noting inconsistencies and mistakes. His years of experience had taught him to pay attention to details, and from the very first letter, he suspected that something wasn't right. Neighbors began to notice as well. Mrs. Ellis, who lived 2 doors down, stopped by one morning with a pie and a concerned look. "I've been hearing things about the HOA," she said, setting the pie down on the small table in his front yard. "Some of the people there, they're not playing fair." He nodded, accepting the gesture with a small smile, but didn't share all the thoughts racing through his mind. He wanted to see how things unfolded before drawing conclusions. Patience had always served him well. Despite the tension, he tried to keep life normal. He spent mornings in his workshop, fixing old radios for the local kids, teaching them how things worked. In the afternoons, he would walk around the block, greeting neighbors and enjoying the sunlight. He talked to the mail carrier, who had delivered letters to him for years, and to the young father pushing a stroller past his house. Life, he reminded himself, was about balance. There were still good moments even when trouble was brewing quietly in the background. One evening, while he was watering the flowers near his front porch, he noticed 2 men approaching his driveway. They were dressed sharply in dark jackets, and they carried themselves with a sense of authority that made him pause. But something about them felt off. Their gait was too stiff, their eyes too alert, and the way they scanned the house seemed rehearsed. He straightened, putting down the hose, and watched as they came closer. "Good evening," one of them said, his voice firm, almost commanding. "We're here on official business from the Homeowners Association." He raised an eyebrow, keeping his tone calm. "Official business, you say? And who exactly are you?" The man hesitated, as if expecting him to already know. "We're officers," he said finally. "We have the authority to enforce HOA regulations and to take action if necessary." He studied them carefully. Something in his gut told him to be cautious. In all his years, he had dealt with authority figures before, some friendly, some hostile. But these men didn't have the confidence or the knowledge that real officers carried. Their badges looked cheap, their demeanor forced. He kept his hands visible, leaning lightly on the railing, and said slowly, "I see. And what action exactly are you here to take?" The answer came with a hint of impatience. "We may need to take you in for questioning regarding violations of community rules." He let out a soft, controlled laugh. "Take me in? For what?" His voice was calm but firm, and it carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime not easily intimidated. He had faced real threats, real danger, and he knew how to read people quickly. These men were bluffing, and they didn't realize who they were dealing with. Still, he didn't underestimate them. Experience had taught him that overconfidence could be dangerous. He spoke clearly, almost conversationally. "I'm happy to discuss any concerns you have, but I will only speak to someone who is legitimately authorized. I know my rights and I know who is allowed to enforce them." For a moment, the men exchanged nervous glances. The confidence he radiated, born of decades in uniform, seemed to unsettle them. They muttered something about needing to check documents and made a vague reference to fines, but their words lacked the precision that someone truly authorized would have used. He noticed every detail, the incorrect terminology, the slightly crooked badge, the hesitation in their voice, and quietly felt a sense of satisfaction. He wasn't scared, and he wouldn't be rushed into anything. After a few tense minutes, the men finally turned and walked back to their car. He watched them drive away, his mind racing through the possibilities. Clearly, the HOA was testing boundaries, trying to see how far they could push. But he knew they had underestimated him. He had connections, he had knowledge, and he had a calmness that came from facing real danger in his youth. They didn't realize that he knew real officers, real procedures, and that he had the skills to protect himself without escalating unnecessarily. That night, he sat by his window, sipping a warm cup of tea, and thought about what had happened. The quiet streets outside seemed calm again, but he knew better. Something had shifted. The neighborhood, which had always felt safe, was starting to show cracks. And he understood that patience, observation, and knowledge would be his greatest allies in the days to come. He didn't sleep much that night, but he wasn't afraid. Fear was not something that controlled him. He reviewed every detail of the encounter in his mind, thinking through possible scenarios and how he might respond to each. He thought about the men's car, the way they spoke, the angle of the sun when they arrived, even the faint scent of perfume from one of the women in the neighborhood who had come too close to their car. Every detail mattered. By the time the sun rose, he was ready. He stepped outside again, stretching his back and taking a deep breath of the morning air. The neighborhood looked just the same, as if nothing had changed, but he knew the truth. Change was coming and he needed to be ready. For now, he would continue his routine, keep an eye on his surroundings, and stay calm. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Something was coming. Something that would test his patience, his courage, and his years of experience in ways he had not yet imagined. And so, the days passed with a strange mix of normalcy and tension. He went about his chores, greeted neighbors, and tended to his garden, all while keeping a careful eye on the letters, the cars, and the people who moved too deliberately past his home. Life had taught him that danger often arrived quietly, wrapped in ordinary events, and that the only way to survive it was to stay alert, stay calm, and trust one's instincts. He didn't know exactly what the HOA had planned next, but he was confident of one thing. They had made a mistake. They had underestimated him. And when the time came, they would see that a 72-year-old veteran was not someone who could be intimidated by badges, threats, or false authority. The neighborhood still looked peaceful, but behind his quiet eyes he was ready. He had survived worse than this, and he would survive this too. The next morning, the air felt heavier than usual. The veteran went about his usual routine, watering the plants and tidying up the small garden in front of his house. He tried to keep things normal, but there was a tension in the neighborhood that couldn't be ignored. The mail had come earlier, and among the usual letters was another notice from the HOA. It was formal, with bold letters and phrases that tried to sound threatening, but he could see through it immediately. The grammar was slightly off. The seals were printed instead of embossed, and the names were inconsistent. Someone was trying hard to look official but failing. He read the letter carefully, taking note of every word. It spoke about immediate action and legal consequences if he didn't comply with some supposed violation regarding his driveway. He frowned and muttered under his breath, "They're really pushing it now." He wasn't worried about the rules themselves. He had always kept his property neat, and nothing he did could even remotely be considered a violation. It was clear this was about intimidation, a test of whether he would back down. By late morning, a car slowly drove past his house again. He noticed it immediately. The same dark vehicle from a few days ago, 2 men inside, scanning the property as they passed. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from alertness. He had faced more dangerous situations than a couple of men pretending to have authority, yet he knew that mistakes could be made if he wasn't careful. He went inside briefly to get his phone and make sure it was charged and ready. If things escalated, he wanted to have a record and a way to call for real help. Around noon, the doorbell rang. He paused for a moment, glancing through the small window beside the door. 2 men stood there, sharply dressed, holding folders that seemed to carry paperwork. They had a strange confidence about them, the kind that tried to make people obey without question. He opened the door just a crack, enough to speak clearly and keep his distance. "Good afternoon," one of the men said with a firm tone. "We are officers from the Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your violations immediately. Failure to comply may result in arrest." He studied them carefully. Their uniforms were wrong, the badges cheap and poorly made, and their tone lacked authority. Still, he stayed calm, leaning slightly on the door frame. "Arrest? For what exactly?" His voice was measured, steady. He didn't raise it, but every word carried weight. The man with the folders shifted uncomfortably. "You have ignored multiple notices. We are required to take action. Please come with us so we can resolve this." He shook his head slowly, a small smile forming on his lips. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I've reviewed every notice. Everything I've done is within the rules. You claim to be officers, but I need to verify your credentials before I can take any action. Who exactly are you reporting to?" They hesitated. One of them muttered something about the HOA board. The other tried to quickly flip through the folder as if it would help, but their nervous energy betrayed them. He noticed the small mistakes immediately, the wrong format of the documents, the absence of a real seal, and the overuse of threatening language. This was not official procedure. He knew real law enforcement would never behave like this. "I'm happy to cooperate once I know who you are and who you report to," he said calmly. "Until then, I will not allow anyone to enter my property under threat. You understand that, correct?" The men glanced at each other, clearly frustrated. One of them tried to step forward, raising his voice slightly. "We can make this easier if you just comply. You know, for your own good." He stood taller now, his calm exterior hiding the readiness that years of training had instilled in him. "I've lived through far worse than empty threats from people pretending to be officers. Step back or I will treat any further attempt as trespassing." A neighbor had been watching from across the street, an older woman who had lived there almost as long as he had. She hurried over, clutching her handbag, and whispered, "Are you okay? Should I call someone?" He shook his head gently. "Not yet. Let them make their mistakes first." He kept his eyes on the men, ready for any sudden move. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of fear. They were bluffing, and he was aware of it. The men tried again, presenting a small electronic device they claimed was for official verification. He glanced at it and frowned. "That's not a law enforcement device. You're trying too hard to appear legitimate." Their frustration was visible now. One of them muttered under his breath, and the other tapped the folder impatiently. It was clear they had not expected resistance. Most people, they assumed, would panic and comply. They didn't know he had lived through situations where the stakes were far higher, where split-second decisions determined life or death. They were amateurs, and he could see it in their movements and hesitation. "You are required to comply. the man said again, his tone sharper. "I am also required to know my rights," he replied. "I am aware of what real law enforcement looks like, and I can tell that you are not real officers. Please leave my property immediately before I am forced to call the actual authorities." The tension was palpable. Birds had stopped singing, neighbors were peeking from behind curtains, and even the wind seemed to pause. The men took a step back, clearly reconsidering their approach. One of them tried to smile, an attempt at charm that failed miserably. "We don't want any trouble. We're just doing our job. And I am just living my life," he said evenly. "If you want to resolve this, do it through the proper channels. Anything else is illegal." For a moment there was silence. Then, almost as if deciding that bluffing further would not work, the men turned and walked back to their car. The younger one muttered something about checking with the HOA board again, and the older one slammed the car door shut. They drove slowly down the street, their confidence replaced by frustration and unease. The veteran watched them go, making a mental note of the car model, license plate, and even the way they had spoken. Every detail could matter later. He returned, inside, closing the door and locking it securely. But he didn't feel fear. He felt prepared. He had survived more dangerous situations, and he knew the importance of staying calm and thinking clearly. He called a friend in law enforcement, a former colleague who had worked with him decades ago. He explained the situation, calmly, giving all the details from the letters to the attempted confrontation at his door. His friend listened carefully, then assured him that the next step was to document everything, remain vigilant, and that he could call the real police if there was any attempt at physical intimidation. After the call, he sat quietly in his living room, sipping tea and reflecting. It wasn't just about him anymore. The neighborhood had seen this confrontation, and others might be next. Standing up against false authority was not just a personal matter. It was a statement for the community. He understood the responsibility that came with knowledge and experience. He had the ability to protect himself and to ensure that those who tried to abuse power were held accountable. That evening, he walked slowly around his yard, checking the gates, the locks, and even the motion sensors he had installed over the years. Precaution was always wise, but he also understood that fear was unnecessary. Confidence, preparation, and calmness were the real weapons here. He thought about the men who had come to his door. They were clever enough to appear threatening, but not clever enough to see through him. Experience had taught him that. He also knew that the story didn't end here. The HOA would not give up easily. They were driven by control, by the desire to assert power, and they had underestimated him. But he was ready. He had contacts, knowledge, and most importantly, a clear mind. He would face whatever came next with the same steady resolve he had maintained throughout his life. As the sun set, painting the sky with soft orange and pink hues, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. He would not be intimidated. He would not comply with false authority, and he would make sure that any attempt to threaten him or others in the neighborhood would be met with knowledge, courage, and calm action. For now, the neighborhood seemed peaceful again, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The real challenge had yet to arrive, and when it did, he would be ready because he was a veteran, a man who had faced real danger, and a man who refused to be fooled by appearances. The fake officers might have thought they had power, but they had underestimated him, and that was a mistake they would soon regret. The morning began quietly, as if the neighborhood was taking a deep breath before the chaos that was about to unfold. The veteran woke early, as usual, and brewed a cup of coffee, his mind already planning the day. He could feel it in his gut. The situation with the HOA was not over. The confrontation from the previous day had shown him that they were willing to take risks, and he knew from experience that people like that rarely gave up easily. As he sipped his coffee, there was a sudden knock on the door. It was more forceful this time, urgent in a way that demanded attention. He glanced through the window and immediately recognized the same two men from before. Their faces were set with determination, and there was a hint of frustration in their eyes. This was no casual visit. They were escalating. He straightened, put his mug down, and walked slowly to the door. Keeping his movements deliberate and calm, he cracked it open just enough to speak. "Good morning, how can I help you today?" The taller man pushed forward slightly, his voice louder than before. "We are here to take you in for violations. You will come with us peacefully." He raised an eyebrow, his tone calm but firm. "Violations? I have received your letters. I have reviewed them. There is nothing I have done that breaks any rules. You are not real law enforcement, and I will not allow you to forcibly remove me from my home." For a brief moment the men hesitated, clearly taken aback by his unwavering calm. But they quickly regained their composure, as if they had rehearsed this confrontation multiple times. "You don't have a choice. Compliance is mandatory." He shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. "I assure you, compliance is not mandatory when the people demanding it are acting outside the law. Step back now, or I will have no choice but to treat any further attempts as trespassing." The tension in the air was palpable. A few neighbors had begun to peek through windows and from driveways. They could see the standoff forming, and whispers spread like wildfire. Some were worried, some curious, but everyone sensed that something serious was unfolding. One of the men reached into his pocket, clearly looking for something, a device, a badge, or perhaps a weapon, but he couldn't decide. The hesitation betrayed his lack of real authority. The veteran noticed every movement, cataloging it mentally. Years in the military had trained him to observe, to anticipate, and to stay 2 steps ahead in tense situations. "You will come with us," the man said again, trying to assert control. "I will not," the veteran replied evenly. "I am willing to discuss any legitimate concerns through proper channels. You may leave my property now." The taller man's face hardened. He stepped closer, as if the threat of physical intimidation would force compliance. But the veteran was ready. He had anticipated this escalation and had already prepared. His hand moved subtly toward his phone, keeping it in clear view. "I am calling the real authorities. Any attempt to forcibly remove me will be considered illegal. You understand that, don't you?" The men froze. They were not expecting resistance backed by knowledge and preparation. The veteran's calm, authoritative voice carried weight. They glanced at each other, unsure how to proceed. Their bluff was failing. He slowly pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a familiar number. "I need immediate assistance," he said clearly when the call was answered. "I have 2 individuals at my door claiming to be officers, but they are not legitimate. They are threatening to forcibly take me from my home. Please respond quickly." The voice on the other end of the line reassured him that help was on the way. While he waited, he kept his eyes on the men, never taking his focus off them. They shifted their weight nervously, muttering to each other, but neither made another move toward the door. Minutes felt like hours, but he remained calm, speaking occasionally in a firm, measured voice. "You are trespassing. Step back now. Leave my property, or you will be held accountable." One of the men tried to step forward again, but the veteran's posture, unwavering gaze, and steady voice made him hesitate. There was no fear, no panic, just the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse situations. The man stopped, his hand half raised, unsure if advancing was worth the risk. A neighbor, an older woman with a sharp eye, called out from across the street. "Are you okay? Do you want me to help?" He shook his head slightly, keeping his tone calm but audible enough for the men to hear. "Everything is under control. Just stay back and observe." Finally, the sound of sirens in the distance made the men flinch. The veteran had timed it perfectly. He knew which routes the police would take and how long it would take for them to arrive. The sound gave him a subtle edge, pressure on the intruders and reassurance for himself. The men glanced around nervously. The younger one muttered something about leaving, and the taller man cursed under his breath. They hesitated, torn between continuing their bluff and retreating before the authorities arrived. As the police cars pulled into the street, flashing, lights reflecting off the houses, the veteran stepped back from the door. The officers quickly assessed the situation, asking questions and observing the men on his porch. It became immediately clear to the responding officers that these were not legitimate law enforcement personnel. The veteran spoke calmly to the police, explaining the entire sequence of events. He handed over the letters, described the car, and detailed the men's behavior. His ability to remain composed, to recall precise details, impressed the officers. It was obvious that he had been preparing for this confrontation, not with fear, but with careful observation and foresight. The fake officers attempted to argue, but their words fell flat. The real police officers questioned them and quickly determined that they had no legal authority to demand compliance, let alone attempt an arrest. The tension evaporated almost immediately, replaced by a mix of relief and disbelief. The veteran watched as the men were escorted to the police cars. They looked small, embarrassed, and defeated. Their confidence had vanished in an instant, replaced by the realization that they had overstepped their bounds and had targeted someone who would not be intimidated. Once the situation was under control, one of the officers turned to him. "You handled that very well. Most people would have panicked or complied out of fear. You stayed calm and precise, and that made all the difference." He nodded quietly. "Experience teaches you a lot. I've faced real threats before. This was just practice in patience." Neighbors who had gathered on their porches began to murmur among themselves, clearly impressed by his composure. Children peeked from behind doors, curious, but sensing the seriousness of the moment. The veteran offered a small smile, acknowledging their presence without making a show of it. He didn't need to boast. His actions had spoken for him. The police officers reassured him that reports would be filed and that the HOA would be held accountable for sending unauthorized individuals to confront residents. They advised him to document everything and to continue observing for any further attempts at harassment. He spent the rest of the day checking his property, ensuring all locks were secure, cameras were functioning, and motion sensors were active. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. He knew that people who tried to abuse power often returned with different tactics if they thought they had failed. Being ready was simply part of protecting oneself and one's home. Later in the afternoon, he spoke to a few neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation. He reassured them that they should not fear intimidation and that they had the right to demand legitimacy and accountability. His words carried weight, not because he was loud or commanding, but because they came from someone who had faced far more serious challenges and remained unshaken. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the street, he sat on his porch and reflected. This confrontation had tested patience, courage, and calmness, but it had also reaffirmed the power of knowledge and experience. He had handled the situation without aggression, without panic, and without overreaction. That, he knew, was the true strength. He also realized that this was only part of a larger story. The HOA's actions had revealed a willingness to push boundaries and abuse authority. Others might be targeted, and he understood that standing up now was not just about protecting himself, but about setting an example. The neighborhood needed to see that intimidation would not succeed, and that courage combined with careful planning could overcome threats. That night, he made sure to review everything again: letters, phone calls, and even the descriptions of the men. Preparation was never wasted effort, and he wanted to be ready if they tried anything else. He wasn't angry, only focused. Anger, he knew, could cloud judgment. Calmness, attention, and strategy were far more powerful tools. Finally, as the neighborhood quieted and the stars appeared, he took a deep breath. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the lesson was clear. Vigilance was essential, and knowledge could protect more than force ever could. He was ready for whatever came next, confident that he could handle it with the same steadiness and courage that had guided him through decades of life. The fake officers had made a grave mistake, and he knew it. Underestimating someone with experience, patience, and a clear mind was a dangerous gamble, and he had no intention of letting that mistake go unpunished or unchecked. The next morning, the veteran woke to a quiet street, but the neighborhood seemed different. People were lingering on their porches, talking quietly in small groups. The events of the previous day had not gone unnoticed. The news had spread quickly, though it wasn't sensationalized. just neighbors sharing their experiences, their concerns, and a growing sense of respect for the man who had faced the HOA's fake officers without flinching. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the street. It was calm, but he knew that calm could be deceptive. The HOA members were clever and persistent. Just because their previous attempt had failed didn't mean they wouldn't try again. He needed to prepare for what came next, not with fear, but with careful observation and strategy. Experience had taught him that those who overreach often do so multiple times if they think they can find a weakness. He went through his home methodically, checking locks, cameras, and sensors. Everything was functioning perfectly. He even adjusted a few cameras to cover angles he hadn't considered before. This wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. He knew that the people he was dealing with were motivated by control and the belief that fear could bend others to their will. They had underestimated him, and he intended to make sure they didn't try again without consequences. Later that morning, he received a call from one of the officers who had responded during the confrontation. The officer was calm and professional, giving detailed instructions about filing reports, documenting interactions, and preserving evidence. "Make sure you keep all correspondence," the officer said. "Photos, letters, recordings, anything you have. This will be important if the HOA continues this behavior." The veteran nodded, taking notes. He appreciated the officer's thoroughness and clarity. It reinforced something he already knew. Careful, calm action was always more effective than reactionary panic. He thanked the officer and ended the call, already planning how to organize his documentation. He had always been methodical, and this situation was no exception. By midday, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He wanted to see firsthand how neighbors were reacting, and he also wanted to reassure those who might have been intimidated. As he walked, people nodded at him, some offering quiet words of thanks. They had seen him handle the situation with the fake officers, and his calm courage had made an impression. Parents were holding their children closer. Older neighbors were sharing stories of previous disputes with the HOA, and even some younger residents were curious, asking questions about what had happened. He spoke to a few neighbors along the way, keeping his tone friendly but informative. "The important thing is to know your rights and to stay calm," he told them. "Most of the time, authority is respected because people assume it's legitimate. But when someone pretends to have power, you have to make sure you respond appropriately. Do not panic, but do not ignore it either." People listened intently. His words carried weight not because of threats or force, but because of the quiet authority in his voice, the assurance of someone who had faced real danger and come through unshaken. By the time he returned home, he had a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about protecting his own home. It was about setting an example for the entire neighborhood. That afternoon, there was movement near the HOA office. A few residents had started asking questions, requesting meetings, and documenting incidents. The fake officers, embarrassed and exposed, were finding it difficult to continue their intimidation without scrutiny. It became clear that their confidence had been built on the assumption that no one would challenge them. The veteran had shattered that assumption. He spent the evening reviewing the letters and documents that had been sent to him. He made a list of discrepancies, noting dates, incorrect titles, and falsified statements. Every detail mattered. He also documented the attempts by the fake officers to confront him in person, recording the time, location, and manner of each interaction. He knew that careful, precise records could make the difference if legal action became necessary. That night he sat on his porch, reflecting on the events of the past 2 days. He thought about the courage it took not to react with anger, the patience required to observe and anticipate, and the importance of preparation. Most people would have been intimidated, perhaps even frightened into compliance. But he knew that fear could cloud judgment. Calmness, clarity, and careful action were far more powerful. Neighbors had begun to gather quietly outside, watching the lights from his home and speaking in hushed tones. They didn't need to intervene. Their presence alone was a silent support, a way of showing that the neighborhood was watching and that abuse of power would not go unnoticed. The veteran acknowledged them with a small nod, a gesture that conveyed both gratitude and reassurance. Over the next few days, the HOA's behavior changed noticeably. The fake officers were no longer seen patrolling the neighborhood. Letters were sent more cautiously. often containing vague language and avoiding direct threats. It was clear that the exposure of their previous actions had made them wary. The veteran continued to document everything, not out of fear but to ensure that if they tried again, there would be no question of accountability. He also began to receive calls from other residents who had experienced similar intimidation tactics. They wanted advice, guidance, and reassurance. He spoke to them calmly, explaining the importance of remaining composed, documenting incidents, and contacting legitimate authorities when necessary. He became a quiet leader in the community, respected not just for his age or his military service, but for his wisdom, patience, and ability to handle pressure without escalating conflicts. One afternoon, the real police returned for a follow-up, checking on his documentation and offering additional guidance. The veteran appreciated their professionalism and thoroughness. "The key is to stay vigilant but calm," one officer said. "You've done everything right so far." He nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The HOA had underestimated him, but more importantly, he had taken steps to protect his neighbors and set a standard for dealing with threats in a lawful and measured way. Knowledge, preparation, and courage had won over intimidation. Evenings in the neighborhood began to feel safer again. Children played on the lawns, neighbors chatted across fences, and the streets regained their peaceful rhythm. But the veteran remained watchful, knowing that complacency could be dangerous. He continued to monitor the area, check his security measures, and keep thorough records of any HOA activity. Through it all, he reflected on the lessons learned. Courage did not always mean confrontation. Sometimes it meant patience, observation, and strategic action. Strength was not measured by force, but by the ability to remain calm and clear-headed in the face of threats. And most importantly, knowledge and preparation were powerful tools that could protect not just oneself, but an entire community. The veteran's actions had inspired those around him. People who had once been hesitant to question the HOA now felt empowered to stand up for their rights. The neighborhood was becoming more united, aware, and vigilant. The simple act of one man remaining calm, knowledgeable, and prepared had created a ripple effect, encouraging others to be mindful, brave, and attentive. In the evenings, as he sat quietly on his porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset, he felt a sense of peace. The immediate threat had been neutralized, the HOA's fake officers had been exposed, and the neighborhood was safer as a result. But he also knew that vigilance was an ongoing responsibility. Life had a way of testing patience, courage, and wisdom, and he was determined to meet those tests with the same clarity and calm that had guided him through this ordeal. He reflected on how something as ordinary as a quiet neighborhood could become the stage for extraordinary courage. Standing up to false authority, protecting oneself, and safeguarding others required not just strength but clarity, patience, and an unwavering sense of justice. The veteran had shown that true power did not come from intimidation, but from knowledge, preparation, and the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real challenges and emerged unshaken. By the time night fully settled over the neighborhood, the veteran felt a sense of quiet triumph. The fake officers were gone, the HOA had been exposed, and the community was stronger for it. He had not only defended himself, but also set an example for others, proving that intimidation and false authority could be overcome with calm, deliberate action. As the stars appeared in the sky, he made a final mental note. Vigilance was not about fear, but about awareness and preparation. Courage was not about aggression, but about staying composed and making informed choices. And sometimes the quiet actions of a single person could change the course of an entire community. The neighborhood had witnessed it, and they would not forget. The veteran had turned a potential crisis into a lesson in courage, wisdom, and justice. And while the future might hold new challenges, he was ready, calm, and prepared to meet them head-on.